So I'm going to script in real quick the two shorts for the two LS runs, one that was built out of house and one that was built in house. Now we're going to take a look at the actual graphs for both of those videos. So here's the blue vet that we built in-house for about $6,500. You can see by the time we added all the timing it wanted to make the power, it was up to almost 430 at 5,500 RPM, or just a tickle under, and 462 foot-pounds of torque. Pretty healthy. The graph looks pretty smooth. There's not any real big dips or anything to indicate we have a timing issue or a fueling issue anywhere. So, to be fair, throughout the whole poll, the AFRs were about a 12.4. Now we'll go look at the other vet, the LS3. Graph is smooth, very linear. You'll notice the torque output down below 3 is definitely low, and it peaks low, and it also makes horsepower, its peak horsepower is only 386 basically at about 5,800. We kept bouncing the timing around one way or the other, and there was just no change. So and I was taking pretty good size swings, like 2 to 4 degrees, and there was just no change in this. So in the end, it was unsensitive to the timing, which kind of also tells you there's an issue somewhere else in the combination itself. So what would those issues be? Well, the 6-liter is not overboard, just fresh hone, fresh bearings, 706 heads with a stock 189 valve that I ported. They flow just about 250 CFM at cam lift, which that cam is 498 thousandths lift, 212 intake, 222 exhaust. So it doesn't even require aftermarket springs to run. The intake was a Trailblazer SS intake, which is tuned to make peak horsepower also around 5,500 RPM. So we have the displacement, the cam size. The exhaust is a 1/7/8 header with a full 3-inch on both sides with an H-pipe, and there's no restriction there, all right? So it ends up making 430 wheel horse, 460 to 470 foot-pounds of torque. Pretty good. And yeah, you could say it made a couple extra ponies because it does only have a Borgwarner T10, which is a lighter, internally lighter transmission to turn than the T56. But literally it's equal to the difference in rotating mass of the two transmissions that you're spinning at that time. So yes, the T56 Magnum in the black car is a little heavier. So 5 to 10 horse most, as you figure there's a difference there. So maybe with the same trans, maybe this would have got up to 400. But it's a 6.2 liter with a 310 CFM flowing head. The cam lift, it would have been very close to 300 CFM through that intake, or should have been. But why didn't it make the number? Well, that's a good question. One, sheet metal intake that doesn't tune in till 7,500 plus. Don't buy them. They're garbage. You're just going to kill your power, save your money, and buy a Fast or an MSD. It will reward you. Two, the exhaust was undersized. Yes, it was a 2.5-inch mandrel bent, fully custom system. It was a really nice system on the car, but in the end, it was no good. It's not doing it any benefits either. Same size headers as the 6-liter 1/7/8. They were both actually from the same company. I think both sets of headers came from Eckler's. So the 6-liter, even though to make peak horsepower it was, if you do the equation, which is peak RPM times displacement times 0.0009875 divided by the number of cylinders, the peak airflow for the motor ends up being, to make horsepower at that RPM, about 245 CFM. And that's right where it was. And if you do the math, if you take that, convert that to horsepower, so take the 245, multiply by 0.26, then multiply it again by 8, it ends up being right about 480, 490 horse gross at the crank. So it actually, the numbers make sense. The losses to the tire make sense. Whereas the LS3, which at cam lift, it's moving closer to 290 CFM or more, actually, if you look at them even bone stock, and you do the factor on that, we're not getting it through there, and we make less torque with more displacement. It just doesn't add up. And it's why, because the motor is the sum of the parts. So if you don't get everything to tune, where all the effects of the exhaust tuning and the intake tuning lengths are helping to ram those cylinders extra full, you lose the flow, you lose the power, you get what you get. What you get is a very expensive motor that under delivers. And this is a big thing. People fixate on cam, they fixate on the size. But where you should really be fixating on, if you're trying to make a number, is where you want that number to be made, how much CFM will be required to make peak output at that number, and how much your head actually is flowing, and as well as what the intake flows. Because the head and the intake are kind of, the intake can restrict it or it can't. Let me explain. So you can have a cylinder head that flows 315 CFM at cam lift, put an intake on it, and it drops down to, you know, basically, what you want to say it? Sorry, brain farts. Basically, put an intake on it, it drops down to 260. And then the car makes 540 horsepower. Okay, the numbers make sense. But the peak horsepower number will be higher still than it should have been for that combination if you do the equation of displacement versus that. So that's a function of what the head does, is it moves the power where it needs to be if it has enough flow, but it can't compensate for the losses that come further upstream. And what you'll get is an engine that kind of comes up and levels off for a long time, just kind of sits there when you have an overly restrictive intake. And again, in this case of the 6-liter, you can see that. So if you look at, oh, hold on, I'll just do that. If you look at this, it's linear the whole way. It peaks over and then it rolls over because it's not jiving. But you can see that the whole time it never leveled off prior. Now we're going to go to the Trailblazer SS intake on the other cylinder head, and you can see what it does here instead. You look, the horsepower comes up, it kind of rolls over and kind of sits in between. It basically, you could almost say it levels off. Maybe I could throw a little timing in there and just make it become truly level, but I don't know. I tried it. It didn't really make a difference. That I was thinking like, yeah, we'll just leave that extra timing in there. I'm always conservative in that regard. So, long story short, this is a combination that you get when you don't match all your parts together the way they need to be matched. And you got to keep that in mind, because if you don't, this is what happens. You end up investing more for less. And that sucks. Okay, now I'm going to get into that engine math I was talking about in front of the screen. I'm going to put it on a whiteboard so you can see it. When you make a combination, the numbers should align. Things should be very close to reality here. And that's what I want to get at. That's how you know your combination is good. Because you will get the numbers when you hear people talk about doing the math on an engine. If they do their math right and they build everything to that math, or with numbers from the actual parts that confirm what the math is mathing, it kind of plays out. And I'll put an example of this. Years ago, I built a big block for the street. I wanted to make 600 horse, so I poured the crap out of the heads and the intake manifold. Now, the intake was a bad choice. Didn't realize it till after I poured the heads. But at cam lift, these heads flowed about 318 CFM. Great. I'm like, I'm going to make 600 horse easy with a street big block. Learned a real quick lesson, though. I threw the dual plane intake on it. I ported it. Definitely got the flow numbers up. But no matter what, I still lost 40 CFM plus out of that intake. And I was like, oh, man. Well, I'll at least make like 530 plus. Right? So the flow with the intake at cam lift was about 262 CFM. Not bad, but definitely not 600 horse good. So with that, I was also thinking with my equation, like, hey, that means I'm only going to be making peak power at like $5 grand. Why am I wasting all this money on a better valve train? Well, here, was the key takeaway. In the end, that displacement of 446 cubic inches with the cam I had chosen and the flow through the cylinder head, the engine dyno ended up making its peak horsepower at 5,900 RPM. Huh. Well, that's fascinating. And as of later on test, I took an unported stock Victor Jr. intake and threw it on there without even retuning the carb and just did a quick test. And yes, we picked up another 35 horsepower. So probably with some fuel tuning and some other things, we could have picked up even more. It would have been very close to that 600 crank big block I was trying to get to begin with. Now, to be fair, driving a single plane on the street, even with a big block and a stick, kind of sucks, but is what it is. So I went back to the dual plane because, like, it's nice to be able to put a car that has a Viper 6-speed with a 50% overdrive in gear and do 80 down the highway at 1900 and not have the engine coughing and farting all over itself. So sometimes situation dictates. But back to my math. So on that engine was 2014. It's the first time I really started doing the math. I've got a couple hundred of these under my belt at this point, and I've understood, like, the head will kind of dictate where the power is going to be, but the intake will choke the power down to what it's going to be. And when you have an intake that kind of relatively matches the cylinder head, the numbers all kind of align with your equation. So like I said, at cam lift, it was just a little over 250. At cam lift with the CFM, and cam lift with the intake on it, it was tapping out about 245. So take a look at this. 5475 times 364 times our constant divided by number of cylinders, 246. 246 times 0.26 times 8, 511.7 horsepower gross potential. So in other words, the numbers on that really line up. Like, we made 430 wheel. We have a light duty trans and manual trans and a light duty rear end, the Dana, reasonably light wheel and tire package. Losing 80 plus horse to the tire, that makes a lot of sense. That puts it right about where it should have been. So let's go now to the LS3 motor. Now that had a heavier duty transmission, the T56 Magnum, with an 8.8 rear swap in it. So yes, stronger rear end and driveline. Also, I know for a fact that combination burns a little over 100 horsepower at that kind of rough output it should have been in. So we'll continue on. Now we're going to take the same peak RPM times our displacement times our constant. It says to make power, the heads were capable of moving at least 270 CFM. If we take that, we should have made 560 horsepower, but we didn't. And what that indicates is that the intake is too lazy and the exhaust is too restrictive to let it breathe that amount. Did it make power to that point according to the equation? Yes, it did. And that's a number that's pretty reasonable for a bone stock LS head with stock valves and a stock valve job. So it makes a lot of sense that we should have been about 450 plus wheel. And that's what I said earlier. And then I figured out, I added a little over 100 horse to the wheel number, and I did the math on that, and what we ended actually getting out of our mismatched combination was 236 CFM to make about 490 to 500 at best horsepower. So to be honest, I think it's probably a little lower than that. If we were actually able to put both engines as everything in the car was on them minus the trans and driveline, I think we would have seen that too, which doesn't make sense because the LS3 is a significantly better cylinder head even than a ported cathedral port, or even an aftermarket cathedral port. Well, some of those get pretty close. But it doesn't, like I said, this is the part that didn't compute in my head. And having done these other things before, learning that, it's like, okay, so the reality is, with the cam that was in it, it should have made the peak power, with the right intake, we would have made the difference. If we had a fast on that thing, or even a stock LS3, we would have gained power easy. Even with the restrictive exhaust, we probably would have picked up 30 horse, which would have got us within spitting distance of the other engine. And had it had an exhaust to boot that was non-restrictive, it would have then made the numbers it should have made. And I've seen this many times before. People get hung up on a part of the engine, and you can't say it's compression. Both motors are 10-4 to 1. very friendly pump gas. In fact, my motor, the 6-liter I built, I wanted to go more towards 11, but the owner was a little leery about that. I said, all right, that's up to you. I mean, 10.5 is fine for carburetors. I like to go more if I can. With a carburetor, I wouldn't go over 10.5. That's kind of pushing it. But cylinder distribution issues aside that happen with wet intakes, you have much better average distribution in a fuel injected intake. So that's why we can push things up to like 12 to 1 on pump gas. And I like to do that because torque is fun. But like I said, you can see clearly we didn't get out of it what was probably really there. So, and that just reaffirms the fact that piss poor intake choice and piss poor exhaust will really cut you off at the knees, and that's a shame. And the reality is, I think with a fast, with the cam that was in it and that, we would have been probably closer to like 460 or 470 at the wheel. So you're just throwing it away. Like I said, sometimes you have to deal with fitment, but was that intake any significantly lower than a stock LS3 or a fast? No. Was the exhaust significantly undersized? Enough. Because as I found, more power is more power always. And when you're losing power through driveline, you don't want to take anything away that you don't have to. So yeah, there we go. That's my basic lessons on the math and how I use it to help figure out what I need or what I want. There's two things I look at, like what CFM do I need to make that power? And then at what RPM with that kind of CFM is this engine going to make its power? Because you can use those equations both ways to solve what you need. And it's, like I said, it's a fascinating trip down discovery lane when you have flow bench and a dyno, and allows you to do these things. But I figured I'd like to share that because you don't have to be an engine builder with those parts to figure this out. And there's enough out there printed as far as specs for cylinder heads and intake manifolds that you can figure out what you're going to get out of them and where you're going to get it based on your displacement. It's a really fun thing to do. And also just kind of fascinating when it all lines up the way it should. But there's always caveats to every situation, so keep that in mind. Take care.